Greetings, colleagues and friends. Cambria Evans here, the Teaching and Learning EMDR consultant. And y'all, today we are going to be talking about boundaries. Now, we hear a lot about boundaries all over social media. We talk about it a lot as therapists. There's lots of trainings on this. And I want to talk about boundaries to have a more comprehensive conversation from the perspective of women. Having been one for 43 years, there's a lot to say about specific things women in particular, I think, need to understand about boundaries that I wish I had known, 43 years ago. But today we'll be unpacking that in service to therapists working with people around their boundaries and also clients, those of you who are interested in effective therapy, wanting to understand what it means and where we're not fully understanding our potential and power around this important topic. So let's dive in. So, it's interesting when we think about boundaries, the messaging that's going out today is boundaries mean making a line that something is not acceptable. So it's a way that we respond to somebody when they're doing something that we don't like. So, and the way that we're supposed to say that isn't, I'm going to try to figure out how to control your behavior, right? It's more of, I can't control what you decide to do. And should you decide to yell at me right now, I'm going to be walking away from this conversation. So boundaries are about what we are going to do in response to something. And I was talking to a good friend of mine about boundaries. She'll probably come on the podcast. She's an amazing physician. She's an infectious disease physician during the pandemic, one of my best friends and neighbors. And we're talking about boundaries, and she's been teaching me a lot about what comes before boundaries. And what comes before boundaries is a conversation that I had never heard before. It wasn't even an idea that I knew existed. So I wanted to share it with everybody here. So we talk about boundaries in terms of how we're going to respond to something and the way that we're going to say it. And I think what's an interesting reframe is that before that happens, there's a couple steps that are important that we need to kind of back up and notice. If we were thinking about a process or an algorithm, we have different decision points before this boundary setting happens. And I think as women, we are not taught, or it is not normalized in the curriculum that's given to us, that these steps even exist and that they're even available to us. And it's kind of been blowing my mind to use this in my life because it's created so much peace in my life. And so I want to share it with you today so that you can start using it immediately and start reframing how you think about boundaries. And this is all part of the rebrand. This is all part of rebranding trauma therapy, right? So what if we actually backed up 2 steps? And the first step was knowing and believing that we actually get to control what inputs come in and when they get to come in. Let me say that again. It's starting from a belief that we get to control in our own life that belongs to us. We get to control what inputs come in and when they come in. So what does that mean? It means that as women, we are often taught that we are supposed to be available to everyone all the time in all the ways, 24/7. And this becomes even more evident for those of us who have chosen to become mothers. But I think that this training starts before that. And I think that we're given this belief that if we don't make ourselves available to take in an input from somebody, that we're bad. And if we don't do this all the time, then we're bad. There's something about women being trained around availability. Okay? This blew my mind. And I tried this on and I thought, this fits. I have learned in the curriculum of my life that I'm supposed to be available all the time. And if I'm not available, it means something. It means I'm bad. And if I am available, it means I'm good. which tells us when we go into this kind of sense of self, positive and negative beliefs, it tells us that this was indoctrinated in us in like under 5 years old, okay? When it's about self, it's little stuff, okay? And a lot of women got the same curriculum. So to know that at the age of 42 and 43, I have a choice to say, wait a minute, I don't have to always be available. I actually get to choose what inputs come in and when. Let me give you a great example. I have another neighbor who I love dearly. Every Sunday, she's not available. Someone asked her to do something, not available, Sunday. She just made that up. She just made that up. I'm not available on Sunday, right? And so much of the technology around us is designed in a lot of ways to make us so accessible. There's this unspoken rule. If someone calls me and leaves me a voice message, I'm supposed to call them back. I don't know who they are. I've never met them before, right? But there's a rule. I'm supposed to call them back or I'm bad. If someone sends me an email or a text, I'm supposed to respond. And I'm supposed to do it in a couple days or I'm like really a jerk. And I think it's interesting that all these rules have been created and we never actually stop and think, did I sign off on this? This contract that we're in, did I sign off on this? And so how empowering is it to notice that you get to control what inputs come in and when? Now, during the pandemic, a lot of healthcare workers and therapists were just bombarded with requests and calls for help, and it was heartbreaking. And in order to sustain through those years of trauma for all of us, I had a lot of conversations with my friend, the physician who was working in infectious disease, and about this idea of how do we control inputs during this time when people are really suffering? How do we decrease the noise around us? And we talked a lot about this idea of having defenders, right? Having defenders around us that let people know our own rules about what we're available for and when. It could be an auto response on my email. It could be my voicemail on my business phone, my personal phone, right? It could just be teaching people and training people my own framework of availability that I decided for my own life, right? As a woman who's helping other people, how and when I'm going to respond, if at all. Sometimes not responding and sometimes silence is a tool to teach people about how you want to communicate. So thinking about number one, this idea of, how do I control what's coming in and when, right? That's number one. Number two is another decision point that we're not, I think, as women trained to understand as even part of this framework. Number two is this input appropriate or inappropriate? My friend actually, I have to give her credit. My friend actually talked about it like making Post-it notes, right? Like appropriate, inappropriate, and like literally labeling this. Like, is this appropriate or not? Again, empowering us as women with the choice of, is this input even something that I think is okay? Which is different than, something's coming in. It's a request, or it's an email, or it's a text, or it's a relationship, or it's a whatever. Instead of bypassing step number two and just saying, this must be appropriate because I'm supposed to be available and everything's supposed to come in, and asking, is this appropriate or inappropriate based on my rules for my life? No one else is living my life but me. And the rules I create, we can call them boundaries, but the rules I make for my life, the manual of how to interact with me is written by me. I'm not going to take someone else's manual, right? Otherwise, what's the point of doing this for decades and decades? And then I get to decide appropriate, inappropriate. Okay. If it's inappropriate or appropriate, then we get to step number three, which is where most people start from, which is, do I respond or not? Right? I think as women, again, we're taught to be responsive. If I don't respond, I am bad. So we have these inputs coming in. We have some filters and defenders on those. We decide if it's appropriate or not. And then step number three, do I respond or not? Let me check my rule book real fast if I forget. Let me check my manual to see what I want for my life to work for me, to give me the boundaries and the emotional experience I want to have. Because it's not just about boundaries, it's about claiming your emotional experience of your own damn life. And so having this sense of I'm not bifurcating this, of I'm not even going to respond, or I am going to respond, which is a different question than like, oh, something's coming in, I'm taking it in whenever it comes, it must be appropriate. And now I've got to task myself with work, with energetic emotional labor to figure out what I'm going to say. I mean, when you zoom out and look at it, it's kind of ridiculous, but this is what we, especially as women, have been trained to do forever. Many of us. And I'm sure some men too. And I think it's interesting to show up in this space differently because I think it can take people by surprise. They'll want to understand why you're not following their manual of how they think you're supposed to behave and respond and be available. And you're likely to bump up against some pouting, for lack of a better word, some pouting or some difference of opinion about that. And then, this is where it gets sticky for women. We then get to decide, am I going to go back to my manual, to my framework, which defines my emotional experience, which defines my level of peace, which defines the boundaries I have around me? Or am I going to fall back into my old training, my old curriculum I got as a little girl and say, oh shit, you're right. My manual is bullshit. I don't deserve to have my own manual. I'm supposed to have your manual. I apologize. Women are taught to apologize. If we step out into our own manual and come out of the manual of someone else, right, that they wrote for us, we apologize profusely. So sorry. I didn't get back to you because I don't deserve to have my own life, which is a different energy than thank you so much for your patience. Thanks for your patience on my response. Because those two statements are so different energetically, right? One is saying, I'm so sorry for having my own manual. Stupid me, I should be in yours. I should be living in your expectations of me all the time. My bad. Or, yeah, I was living in my manual. I was hanging out there and that's where I live in my life. And thanks for being patient. Do you see the difference? When we profusely apologize, we do so many things internally to ourselves. When we choose to give up our manual and go into someone else's, we're teaching that person, I'm living by your rules. And we're teaching ourselves, you know, that curriculum you got as a little girl? Well, that was right. Because really what that curriculum was teaching you was you don't deserve to have your own space as a person in the world. You don't deserve to have your own emotional experience. Your emotional experience belongs to everybody else. We are reinforcing that bullshit curriculum to ourselves. And that, I think, is the most traumatic part of this. It's not the inputs coming in with their own manuals. That's to be expected. I mean, that's normal. That's so normal. And I think when we get angry or we get offended or we get overwhelmed, I don't think that's about that person coming towards us with their own expectations and manual of what we're supposed to do. I actually think that's our feelings about our choice of abandoning ourselves, of admitting and agreeing, rather, that, you know what, my life is less important than yours. My emotional experience is less important than yours. And my sense of peace in my one life that I get to live, also less important than your needs. This is the angst inside of us that happens when we talk about boundaries. And I want to unpack the nuances of this because it's so important. It's so important for 500 reasons, but the one I'm going to really focus on today is this is the curricular structure we have to get in order to have healthy connections with people that are interdependent instead of codependent. I mean, Melanie Beatty talks about this in her classic book from decades ago, Codependent No More. And she talks about the untangling of people. And I think the reason this is so hard for women is because we're taught to be tangled. We're not taught to be separate people, really, most of the time. Now, for those women who were taught that, bravo. I love it. Keep doing it. It's contagious. Let everyone else see you do it. Be proud of it. Okay, I'm talking about I believe the majority of women were not taught this. And I think it's really hard for women when they become really successful in their careers and the things that they pursue in their lives, because things start to get really confusing for them, right? They might be able to be very assertive and boundaried and interdependent in their work relationships because the stakes are lower if someone gets pissed off. There's less of a consequence than if we do this at home or if we do this in our personal lives, right? There's this consequence of disconnection. There's this consequence of how could you not meet my needs, right? Like that manipulation. And I think something really important happens when women decide, or anyone decides for that matter, to be in themselves with their own manual, because it creates such a healthy, safe space for connection. So much of the discussion around boundaries is incomplete because we learn about boundaries and separation and focusing on self. And then I think it was Esther Perel was recently talking about, all of this is kind of helping people in one way, but also not really giving them a complete conversation around how to have connection. How to have connection with people. So again, this is an incomplete conversation. When we talk about boundaries in the way we are talking about it in the mainstream right now, which is if you do this, I'm going to do this away instead of that, but these other two steps, plus then also how do we connect, right? How do we unpack all these curriculums we've been given? Because guess what? If someone's coming at us, whether it's a man or a woman, they've been given potentially a similar curriculum as well about how we're supposed to respond and how they're supposed to show up. It happens all the time. So I hope this is feeling really helpful for you. And I think that one way that you might want to practice this is, going back to Post-it notes, is if you were to actually write down this process, this algorithm, right? Number one, how do I control what inputs come in and when, and what are my defenders for myself? Number two, when inputs come in through my filters, how am I deciding if they are appropriate or inappropriate, and whose manual am I using, right? Am I using my own manual? Also, do I have a manual? Like this exercise, I think, for my clients can be really confusing because they have this moment of realizing, I have a sense of a manual, but I never got to actually write one because I was just using everyone else's as they came towards me, right? So you might have to actually pause and decide, like, in my life, what is appropriate and inappropriate? I have never defined that before. Let me get curious about that. That's going to take some thoughtfulness to get clear on. I might have to do some experiments to see how these inputs feel, and that will help me label with all the data coming in, help me label what is appropriate or inappropriate. And then number three, do I respond or not? Not how do I respond, but do I respond or not? And then if I choose to respond, what do I then want to say about what I'm going to do should this person choose this behavior? Okay. And I think where this gets confusing for women too is that a lot of us are taught that we are supposed to connect with somebody where they are, not just in their manual, but where they are in their emotional experience. A lot of women are taught, my emotional experience is supposed to chameleon and change and shift given the emotional experience in front of me. If someone's coming at me angry, I'm going to shift my emotional experience in response to their anger. If someone's coming at me sad, I might drop it down to meet them there. Now, is that bad or wrong? I don't know, but it's interesting to think about, isn't it? Because what would it look like instead if someone came at you angry or someone came at you sad, and instead of having to shift yourself away from your own emotional experience, maybe you're having a great day. Maybe you're in a great mood and you don't want to join them in their sadness, or you don't want to join them in their anger, what would it look like as a woman to connect with them, to meet them in different emotional places? Okay. Now, again, if women are doing this now, hats off to you, bravo. I'm speaking about this because a lot of women that come through my practice struggle with this. And I personally have had to learn this later in life because, again, this is a curriculum that's been passed down through generations of women who have come typically from a place of having less power and less control. So what an exciting idea to give yourself permission to believe that in 2023, as a woman, I don't abandon myself. I don't abandon my manual. I don't abandon my emotional experience. I get to live in that. And whatever comes at me, I get to make decisions before I'm responding to somebody, before I'm giving them my energy, my emotional labor, okay? Because emotional labor is real. It is real, especially if you're a parent, especially if you're a therapist or in any kind of healing profession. And it is our job as responsible parents, as responsible healers, to really track our inventory of energy. It is our job to task ourselves with noting when we are doing emotional labor. And it is our job and is responsible to say, I can't invest emotional labor into this because I am not an endless source of it, because that's a silly idea too. And I can't abandon my other commitments and responsibilities that I have decided to put energy into to spread my emotional labor and energy all over the place, all the time when anybody needs it, okay? If these concepts are new to you, I'm giving you 110% permission to try on something different. And I'm also giving you a heads up that people around you who are used to you being so available and responsive and meeting them where they are, they're not going to like it. They're not going to like it. And then the question is, can they connect with you respecting your manual and where you are? How do we decide as two people when we're in very different emotional experiences? How do we figure out where we're going to connect? It's a negotiation. The default isn't, well, because I'm a woman and I'm always available and responsive, I'll shift my emotional experience to come meet you and your feeling. So I think this is revolutionary. I think as women, for us to do this for ourselves gives us a sense of empowerment, gives us a sense of worthiness that we deserve to do this. Because y'all, there are people walking around who just live like this, like all the time. And typically they're the people who have a lot of power. Okay, so there is a power dynamic here. And while we're able to shift certain things in terms of social justice on larger scales, that's a longer process. But this is something that you can do right now, today, to reclaim your emotional experience, to reclaim your life, and to reclaim your power in your life. So I invite you to try it, and I would love to hear how it goes for you. So today was a personal one. I hope this felt personal and helpful for you too. And if you haven't already signed up for our mailing list, I would invite you to do that. Here at Zero Disturbance, we always have thoughtful conversations about psychology, therapy, and just how to make your life yours, right? How to make your life yours. We've given so much of ourselves away in so many different places, and sometimes not by choice. And it's great to think together about how we get to change that moving forward, because it's never too late. So I hope that y'all take care, and I will look forward to seeing you next time.